I've always been a guy who believed in routine. At 55, I had settled into a life that was predictable, comfortable, and, at least I thought, happy. I worked as a financial advisor, the kind of job that kept me busy but not overwhelmed. My wife Karen and I had been married for 28 years. We had two grown kids who had ovid out, leaving our house quiet but peaceful. Our marriage wasn't full of fireworks, but after nearly 3 decades together, I didn't expect it to be. That's just how life goes, right? But everything changed one afternoon last October, the day I got a call from someone I hadn't thought about in nearly 20 years. Doug Harper. Now, Doug and I had been college roommates back in the day. We'd shared too many beers and bad decisions, and for a while we were inseparable. But after college, life got in the way. Doug moved out west for work, we lost touch, and aside from the occasional Christmas card, we drifted apart. So when his name popped up on my phone, I felt a mix of nostalgia and confusion. Why was he calling after all this time? Doug, I answered, leaning back in my office chair, a smile creeping onto my face. Man, it's been forever. How are you? There was a long pause on the other end. Too long. That's when I knew something wasn't right. Phil, I'm sorry to just spring this on you, but I didn't know who else to call, Doug said, his voice lower than I remembered. Well, it's about Karen. That knocked the air out of me. Karen? What the hell could Doug possibly have to say about my wife? They barely knew each other. They'd only met a handful of times, always during some reunion or holiday party years ago. I hadn't even thought Doug was close enough to us to know anything personal about our lives. What about Karen? I asked, my stomach twisting. The words came out sharper than I intended. There was another long silence, and then Doug sighed. Look, man, I wouldn't be calling you if it wasn't serious. But I've got to tell you, Karen and we've been in contact for a while now. My mind went blank, struggling to catch up with what I had just heard. In contact? I repeated, my voice tight. What the hell does that mean, Doug? I'm not proud of this, Doug continued, his tone heavy with regret. It started a few months ago. She reached out to me just to catch up, or so I thought. But things got out of hand fast.
We've been seeing each other, meeting up. The room around me seemed to spin as his words hit me like a freight train. Seeing each other, meeting up. Karen, the woman I had been married to for nearly 30 years, was cheating on me with my old college roommate. The sheer absurdity of it felt like some twisted joke, but Doug's voice told me it was anything but. I gripped the phone tighter, my hand shaking. How long has this been going on? I managed to ask, though I already knew the answer wasn't going to be one I liked. About 6 months, Doug admitted. We stopped it recently. I swear, Phil, it's over. But I couldn't live with myself if I didn't tell you. You deserve to know. 6 months. For half a year, my wife had been sneaking around with a man I'd once considered a friend, a man who, up until this very moment, I had never thought twice about. How had I missed this? What had I been so blind to? I didn't say anything for what felt like a long time. My mind was reeling, trying to piece together the last 6 months of my life and where it had all gone wrong. Karen and I hadn't been perfect, sure, but this was something I never saw coming. Finally, Doug broke the silence. I'm sorry, Phil. Truly, I am. If there's anything I can do, don't, I snapped, cutting him off. You've done enough. I hung up before he could say anything else. The phone dropped from my hand, clattering onto the desk. I sat there in stunned silence, staring at nothing, the weight of what had just happened crashing over me like a wave. Karen, cheating, with Doug Harper. For the first time in my life, I had no idea what to do next. I sat there in my office for what felt like hours, though it was probably only minutes. Doug's voice still echoed in my head, the words playing over and over like some broken record I couldn't shut off. Karen and we've been seeing each other. 6 months. It didn't make sense. I'd always thought our marriage was solid, not perfect, sure. We had our rough patches like anyone else. But we were a team, or at least I thought we were. Karen had been my partner in everything. Raising the kids, navigating the ups and downs of life, even the quiet moments that came with growing older together. And now, this. By the time I got home that evening, the shock had begun to morph into something darker. Anger. I wasn't just angry at Doug, I was furious with Karen. How could she do this? For 6 months, she had been lying to me, pretending everything was fine, all while sneaking around with him. The betrayal cut deeper because it wasn't just some random fling. It was with a man I had once trusted, a guy I had shared beers and late-night talks with back in college. That made it feel personal, like I had been played for a fool on every level. When I walked into the house, it was quiet. Karen was in the kitchen, chopping vegetables for dinner like it was any other night. The smell of garlic and onions filled the room, and for a split second it felt like nothing had changed. But everything had changed. I stood in the doorway watching her. She didn't notice me at first, humming softly to herself as she worked. She looked so normal, like the same woman I had been coming home to for nearly 3 decades. But now, knowing what I knew, everything about her felt like a lie. "Phil?" she asked, glancing up with a smile. "You're home early. How was your day?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. My throat was tight, my fists clenched at my sides. The anger I had been trying to suppress all afternoon was bubbling dangerously close to the surface. Karen must have sensed something was wrong because her smile faltered. "Phil? What's going on?" I stepped into the kitchen, my voice low and cold. "I got a call from Doug today." Her face paled instantly. The knife in her hand hovered in midair, her eyes wide with shock. For a moment, neither of us said anything. It was like time froze between us, the weight of the conversation we were about to have pressing down on us both. "Doug," I repeated, taking a step closer. "He told me everything." Karen's hand trembled, and she slowly set the knife down on the counter. Her lips parted as if to say something, but no words came out. The silence between us stretched longer and thicker, and I could feel my patience snapping thread by thread. "Say something, Karen," I demanded, my voice harsher than I intended. "Tell me why. Why the hell did you do this?" Tears welled up in her eyes, but I wasn't in the mood for tears. Not yet. I needed answers. I needed her to admit to everything Doug had told me, to own up to what she had been doing behind my back for half a year. "Phil, she started, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen." 6 months, I snapped, my hands shaking with anger. "For 6 months, you've been lying to me. You've been sneaking around with Doug, and what? You just thought I'd never find out." Tears spilled down her cheeks now, but I didn't care. I wanted her to feel the pain she had caused. I wanted her to understand just how deeply she had betrayed me. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I didn't mean for it to go this far. It started out as just catching up. I hadn't seen Doug in years, and You reached out to him," I interrupted, the realization hitting me like a punch to the gut. "You were the one who contacted him first." She nodded, wiping at her tears with the back of her hand. "Yes, but I didn't mean for it to turn into what it did. At first we were just talking, and then things got complicated." "Complicated," I repeated, my voice dripping with bitterness. "You mean you started sleeping with him?" Karen flinched at my words, but she didn't deny it. She didn't have to. I already knew the truth. "I don't understand," I said, my anger giving way to something rawer, something that hurt more than the rage ever could. "What did I do wrong? How did we get here?" Karen shook her head, fresh tears streaming down her face. "You didn't do anything wrong, Phil. This wasn't your fault. It was me. I got lost. I started questioning everything. Our marriage, my life, myself. And when Doug came back into the picture, I don't know. It felt like I was stepping back into a part of my past that I'd buried, but it was wrong. I know that." Her words stung. They stung because despite the anger, despite the betrayal, I understood. I understood how easy it was to get lost in the monotony of a long marriage, how nostalgia for the past could twist your thoughts in ways you didn't expect. But understanding didn't make it hurt any less. "So what now?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "What do we do now?" Karen didn't answer right away. She just stood there, looking at me with those tear-filled eyes, the weight of her guilt hanging between us like a barrier we couldn't cross. "I don't know," she finally whispered. "I don't know, Phil, but I'm so sorry." I didn't have anything left to say. The anger was still there, simmering beneath the surface. But it was the sadness, the overwhelming sadness, that took over as I turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving her standing there in the silence of a marriage that felt like it had been shattered beyond repair. I didn't leave the house that night, though every part of me wanted to. I thought about grabbing my keys and driving off, finding a hotel, or even crashing at a friend's place, anywhere but here. But something kept me rooted. Maybe it was the weight of 28 years together, the life Karen and I had built, the kids we had raised, the memories that filled every corner of the house. It was all too much to just walk away from, even though I felt like I should dot instead comma. I went to the guest room, closing the door behind me and sinking down onto the edge of the bed. My mind was racing, replaying everything Karen had said. The words "I got lost" echoed in my head. What did that even mean? How does someone get lost in a marriage like ours? Hadn't we been through enough together to know where we stood? But then again, maybe that was the problem. Maybe we had become so comfortable in our routines, so settled into the daily grind, that we had stopped noticing each other, stopped being present. I knew I wasn't perfect. I had my flaws, my blind spots, but cheating. I never thought we'd be here. I lay back on the bed, staring up at the ceiling, feeling like a stranger in my own home. The betrayal cut deep, but there was something else that gnawed at me, something I couldn't shake. The fact that Karen had chosen Doug. Of all people, Doug, the guy I had once trusted, the guy who had been a part of my past. Sleep didn't come easily that night. I tossed and turned, my mind refusing to shut down. I kept replaying the conversation with Doug, the tears in Karen's eyes, the way she had looked so small, so broken in the kitchen. I wanted to hate her, to be consumed by anger, but underneath it all was the nagging thought that maybe, just maybe, I was part of the problem too. By the time the sun began creeping through the blinds, I hadn't slept at all. My body felt heavy, my head pounding, but I knew I couldn't avoid Karen forever. We needed to talk, really talk. No more lies, no more avoidance. We had to face whatever this was head on, even if the truth was uglier than I wanted to admit. I dragged myself out of bed and headed to the kitchen. Karen was already there, sitting at the table, a cup of coffee in front of her. She looked like she hadn't slept either. Her eyes were red and swollen, her hands wrapped tightly around the mug, as if it were the only thing keeping her grounded. For a moment, we just stared at each other. The silence between us felt thick, heavy with everything that still needed to be said. I sat down across from her, not bothering to make coffee for myself. I wasn't sure I could stomach it anyway. "We need to talk," I said, my voice sounding rough, even to me. Karen nodded, her eyes downcast. "I know." I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. "I don't understand, Karen. I don't understand how we got here. I thought we were fine." She looked up at me, her eyes filled with sadness. "I thought we were too. But somewhere along the way, I started feeling empty. Like I wasn't the person I used to be. Like I wasn't even sure who I was anymore." I frowned, trying to wrap my head around what she was saying. "But why didn't you tell me? Why didn't we talk about it before it got this far?" "I don't know," she whispered, shaking her head. "I guess I was afraid that if I said it out loud, it would make it real. And maybe I didn't want to admit it to myself. It wasn't about you, Phil. You didn't do anything wrong." "That's not how it feels," I said, my voice sharp with hurt. "It feels like I wasn't enough, like I wasn't paying attention and you went looking for—" "What, some part of yourself with Doug?" Karen winced at his name, tears welling in her eyes again. "I wasn't looking for anything with Doug, it just happened. We reconnected, and at first it was just talking. But then I started feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time. I'm not excusing it, Phil. I'm just trying to explain it." The words hit me hard. I felt something tighten in my chest, a wave of hurt and anger rising again. "So what? You felt something was missing, and instead of talking to me, you decided to have an affair?" "It wasn't supposed to happen," Karen said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I never planned for it. But when it started, I didn't know how to stop. And the more it went on, the more lost I felt." "Lost," I repeated, my voice bitter. "That seems to be the word of the day." We sat in silence for a long time after that, the tension between us thick and suffocating. I couldn't bring myself to look at her. I didn't want to see the pain in her eyes because it only reminded me of my own. Finally, Karen spoke again, her voice trembling. "I know I've hurt you. I know I've destroyed your trust, and I don't expect you to forgive me. But I want you to know that I love you, Phil. I do. I always have. I made a horrible mistake." I looked up at her, and for the first time, I saw the depth of her guilt, her regret. But I wasn't ready to forgive her. Not yet. Maybe not ever. I wasn't sure what the future held for us, but I knew that things could never go back to the way they were. Too much had changed. "I don't know if love is enough," I said quietly. "Not after this." Karen nodded, her face crumpling. "I know. I understand." I stood up from the table, my hands trembling. "I need time to figure this out, Karen. I can't just pretend everything's okay. I need space." She didn't argue, didn't try to convince me otherwise. She just nodded again, wiping at her eyes with the sleeve of her sweater. "Take all the time you need." I walked out of the kitchen, grabbing my coat and keys on the way out the door. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I needed to be anywhere but here. The house felt too full of memories, too full of her, and I couldn't breathe under the weight of it all. As I drove, the anger and hurt swirled inside me. But there was something else, too. Something that scared me even more than the pain. It was the thought that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't just about Karen's betrayal. Maybe this was about me too. About the cracks in our marriage that I hadn't wanted to see. About the things we had both ignored for far too long. In And as much as I wanted to pin all the blame on her, a part of me knew that if we were going to have any chance of moving forward, together or apart, I'd have to face those truths too. I drove aimlessly for hours that day, the familiar streets of our town blurring together as I circled block after block, trying to make sense of the mess my life had become. The anger was still there, simmering under the surface, but now it was mixed with something even worse, doubt. Not just doubt in Karen, but in myself, in our entire marriage. Had I been blind to the cracks that were clearly there? Had I been so caught up in the routines and the predictability of our life that I hadn't seen my wife slipping away? The fact that she had reached out to Doug, of all people, told me she wasn't just looking for excitement. She was searching for something more, something she felt she'd lost. And I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that maybe I had lost it too. Eventually, I found myself parked in front of a small cafe near the outskirts of town. I hadn't been here in years, but it used to be Karen's favorite place when we were younger. We'd come here on lazy Saturday mornings before the kids were born, back when life was simple. I wondered when it had stopped being our go-to spot, and more importantly, why I hadn't noticed it fading from our lives. I sat there for a long time, staring at the entrance, debating whether to go inside. I wasn't hungry, but something about the place felt comforting, like it held the echoes of who we used to be, before the weight of years and responsibilities piled up. Before Doug. The thought of him made my stomach turn. Doug Harper, the guy I used to call a friend. Now, just hearing his name filled me with rage. I hadn't responded to any of his calls or messages since the initial confession, but his words still haunted me. He had betrayed me just as much as Karen had, but there was something especially painful about his role in all of this. It wasn't just an affair, it was with someone I trusted. Before I could think too much about it, my phone buzzed in the cup holder. For a second, I thought it might be Karen again, but when I looked down, I saw a different name flash across the screen. Daniel, our son. I hadn't told him anything about what was going on. The last thing I wanted was to drag our kids into this mess, especially since they were both out living their own lives now. But seeing his name made me realize how much I missed him, how much I wanted to just talk to someone who wasn't wrapped up in the tangled web of my marriage. I answered the call, trying to sound normal. "Hey, Dan. Dad," came Daniel's familiar voice, filled with its usual energy. "How's it going? You and Mom okay?" It was a simple question, but it felt like a punch to the gut. I hesitated, unsure of how to answer. We're fine," I lied, my voice tight. "Just a lot going on." "Yeah, I hear that," Daniel replied. "Work's been nuts on my end. Listen, I wanted to see if you and Mom were up for a visit this weekend. Jamie's been asking about her grandparents, and I thought we'd come by, maybe take you guys out to dinner." My throat tightened. God, the thought of pretending everything was fine in front of Daniel, his wife, and their daughter felt impossible right now. But I didn't want to tell him what was really happening. Not yet. "That sounds great," I said, forcing a smile even though he couldn't see it. "Let me check with your mom, and I'll get back to you." "Sure thing," Daniel replied. "Everything's good with you two, right? You sound a little off." I could hear the concern in his voice, and it nearly broke me. Daniel had always been perceptive, always tuned into the moods of those around him. He was a lot like Karen in that way, empathetic, always worrying about everyone else. And here I was, about to lie to him to keep up the facade. "We're fine," I repeated, trying to sound convincing. "Just a lot on my mind." Daniel paused for a moment as if considering whether to push the issue, but he eventually let it go. "All right, Dad, let me know about this weekend." "I will," I promised. And after we said our goodbyes, I hung up, staring at the phone in my hand. The thought of seeing Daniel and his family made me realize just how much was at stake. If Karen and I couldn't fix this, if we couldn't find some way to salvage what was left of our marriage, it wouldn't just be our lives that were affected. It would ripple out to our kids, our grandkids, and the life we had built as a family. How could I sit across the table from Daniel and pretend everything was fine when I wasn't even sure if my marriage would survive the week? I put the phone down and leaned back in the driver's seat, closing my eyes. I needed to talk to someone, but not Daniel. Not yet. I needed someone who could help me figure out what to do next. Linda, my sister. I hadn't called her in months. We were close, but life had a way of keeping us from connecting as often as we used to. But if there was anyone who could give me perspective on this whole mess, it was Linda. She had been through her own divorce years ago and had somehow come out the other side stronger. I had always admired her for that. Without thinking too much about it, I dialed her number. It rang twice before she picked up. "Phil," she answered, her voice bright. "Long time no hear, brother. What's going on?" I didn't waste any time getting to the point. "Linda, I need to talk. It's about Karen." Her tone immediately shifted. What's wrong? Are you okay? I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the last few days pressing down on me. No, not really. I told her everything. About Doug, about the affair, about the gut-wrenching conversation in the kitchen. By the time I finished, I was barely holding it together, my voice shaking as I tried to explain how lost I felt, how much I didn't know what to do next. Phil, Linda said quietly when I was done, I'm so sorry. I can't even imagine what you're going through right now. Yeah, I muttered, staring out the window. I don't know if I can get past this, Linda. How do you get past something like this? There was a pause on the other end, and then Linda spoke, her voice calm and steady. You don't get past it, Phil. Not really. You either figure out how to move forward together or you don't. But getting past it? That's not how this works. I let her words sink in, trying to make sense of them. So what do I do? Do I stay? Do I leave? I can't answer that for you, she said gently. But I do know that if there's any part of you that still loves Karen, if there's any part of you that thinks this can be fixed, then you owe it to yourself to try. You don't have to make any decisions right now. Take your time, but don't walk away without knowing for sure. Her words hit me hard. There was a part of me that still loved Karen, that much was true. But was that enough? Could love survive a betrayal like this? I don't know if I have it in me to try, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. You're stronger than you think, Linda replied. But whatever you decide, make sure it's a decision you can live with. For you, not for anyone else. I thanked her, and after we hung up, I sat there in the car, staring at the cafe again. It had felt like a lifetime ago that Karen and I used to sit in there, laughing, talking about the future, unaware of how complicated life would become, how fragile everything could be. I wasn't ready to walk away from my marriage. Not yet, but I wasn't sure if I had the strength to fix it either. The only thing I knew for certain was that I couldn't keep running from the truth. I had to face Karen, face the reality of what had happened, and decide whether or not there was anything left to save. I spent the next few days in a strange limbo, avoiding any real confrontation with Karen while trying to figure out where my head was. I couldn't bring myself to stay in the same house as her for too long, so I started spending most of my time at work, even when there wasn't much to do. I told myself that I was giving us both space, but in reality, I was avoiding the inevitable. The conversation that would decide whether we had a future together or not, Karen, to her credit, didn't push. I'd catch glimpses of her in the mornings or late at night, her face drawn and exhausted, the weight of her guilt clear in every movement. But she didn't press me to talk, didn't beg for forgiveness, didn't plead for me to stay. It was as if she knew I needed time, and she was giving it to me, even though I could see the strain it put on her. One night, about a week after everything came out, I found myself sitting in the living room staring at the television without really watching it. The house was eerily quiet. Karen tucked away in the bedroom, no doubt wondering what my next move would be. I had been sleeping in the guest room ever since that first night, the unspoken agreement between us that nothing could go back to normal until we figured out where we stood. I muted the TV and sat there in the silence, my thoughts racing. Linda's words kept coming back to me. You either figure out how to move forward together, or you don't. But how was I supposed to move forward when I couldn't even wrap my head around how we got here in the first place? Could I forgive Karen? Did I want to? I found myself thinking about the life we had built, the good times, the bad, the mundane moments in between. Our marriage wasn't perfect, but we had weathered so many storms together over the years. We had raised 2 great kids, built a home, supported each other through all the ups and downs that came with life. And now this affair had shaken everything to its core. I thought about Doug, too. I still hadn't spoken to him since that first phone call, and the bitterness I felt toward him was just as raw as it had been a week ago. But for the first time, I realized that my anger toward him wasn't what mattered. This wasn't about him. It was about Karen and me, about whether or not we could rebuild something from the wreckage of what we once had. And that's when I knew it was time to talk. I got up, walked down the hallway, and stopped in front of the bedroom door. My hand hovered over the doorknob for a moment before I took a deep breath and turned it. Stepping inside, Karen was sitting on the bed reading a book. Though from the way she was staring blankly at the pages, I knew she wasn't really absorbing any of it. She looked up when she heard me come in, her expression wary, as if she was bracing herself for whatever was coming. Can we talk? I asked, my voice softer than I expected. Karen nodded, setting the book aside. She looked so tired, her shoulders hunched, her eyes puffy from too many sleepless nights. I sat down in the chair by the window, keeping some distance between us, but ready to finally get everything out in the open. I've been thinking, I began, staring down at my hands. About us, about everything. Karen didn't say anything, just waited for me to continue, Her eyes locked on me like she was afraid I'd disappear at any moment. "I'm not going to pretend that I'm okay with what happened," I said slowly, choosing my words carefully. "You betrayed me, Karen. You lied to me for months, and you broke my trust. And I don't know if we can ever get back to what we had." Her face crumpled, but she kept quiet, nodding slightly, her fingers gripping the edge of the bed. But I continued, surprising even myself. "I'm not ready to throw away 28 years of marriage without at least trying to figure out if there's anything left to save." Karen's eyes filled with tears, and she opened her mouth to speak, but I held up a hand to stop her. "Let me finish." She closed her mouth, biting her lip, waiting for me to continue. "I don't know if I can forgive you. Not yet. Maybe not ever," I said honestly. "But I also know that we've built a life together, and I owe it to myself and to you to at least try. We've been through too much to just walk away without trying to figure out what went wrong." Karen wiped her eyes, sniffling softly. "Phil, I'm so sorry. I know I can't undo what I've done, and I don't expect you to just forgive me. But I love you. I never stop loving you. And I'll do whatever it takes to fix this, if you'll give me the chance." I let her words sink in. I didn't know if I believed her, not entirely. But the fact that she was willing to admit her mistake, to take responsibility for what she had done, meant something. It meant that maybe, just maybe, there was a chance for us to find our way back. "I don't want to rush this," I said. "We're going to need help, real help, counseling, therapy, whatever it takes. And we're going to have to be honest with each other, even when it's hard." Karen nodded, her expression one of pure relief. "I'm willing to do anything, Phil. I'll go to counseling, I'll do whatever you need. I just want us to find a way through this." There was a long pause as I let her words sink in. It wasn't going to be easy, I knew that. But for the first time in days, I felt a glimmer of hope, a possibility that maybe, just maybe, we could rebuild something from the wreckage. "I'm not saying we'll get through this," I warned, my voice steady. "I'm just saying we can try." Karen nodded again, her eyes still wet with tears, but there was a softness to her expression that I hadn't seen in a long time. It was as if the weight of the secret she had been carrying had finally lifted, leaving her raw but real. And in that moment, I realized that we were finally seeing each other for the first time in a long time. Not as the couple who had fallen into the monotony of daily life, but as two people who had been hurt and flawed, but still wanted to fight for what they had built. I got up from the chair and walked toward the bed, sitting down next to her. For a long moment, we sat in silence, side by side, both of us processing what had just happened. The road ahead was going to be long, and it wouldn't be easy. But for the first time, I felt like we were facing it together. The decision to try wasn't the end of the road. It was just the beginning of a long, painful journey. As Karen and I sat on that bed in silence, the weight of everything that had happened settled between us, a reminder of how fragile things had become. But for the first time in weeks, I felt like we were both ready to take the first step forward. The next morning, Karen made the call to schedule a counseling appointment. She didn't hesitate or drag her feet, which surprised me. I half expected her to stall or wait for me to take the lead, but she was serious. Maybe she had already realized how close she was to losing me, to losing everything we had built. Either way, her willingness to start the process gave me a small sliver of hope. Our first session was brutal. We sat across from each other in the therapist's office, the air thick with tension. The therapist, a middle-aged woman named Diane, asked us to be honest about where we were emotionally. Karen spoke first, her voice small but steady, as she admitted the full weight of her guilt. She talked about how she had felt disconnected, how reaching out to Doug had been a desperate attempt to fill the void she didn't know how to talk about. "I know I betrayed Phil," she said, her hands twisting in her lap. "I know I hurt him in a way that's going to take a long time to heal, but I wasn't thinking clearly. I was lost in my own head. And when Doug came into the picture, I didn't stop myself like I should have. I sat there, my arms crossed, listening to her, still feeling a sharp pang of anger every time she mentioned Doug's name. It was hard to sit there and hear her talk about it so matter-of-factly, but part of me understood that she was trying. She was trying to explain something that maybe she hadn't even fully understood herself until now. When it was my turn to speak, I found it harder than I expected. I thought the words would come easily, that I would be able to express the betrayal, the anger, the hurt. But when I opened my mouth, all that came out was, "I don't know if I can ever trust her again." It was the truth. I didn't know how to trust her anymore. For 6 months, she had lied to my face, pretended everything was normal, all while sneaking around with Doug. That kind of betrayal didn't just heal overnight. And sitting there in that office, I wasn't sure if it would ever fully heal. Diane nodded, her face neutral but understanding. Trust is the foundation of any relationship, and when it's broken, it can take a long time to rebuild. But the fact that you're both here, willing to try, is a good sign. I wasn't so sure about that, but I didn't say anything. I wasn't ready to commit to the idea that being here was a good sign. For me, it was just something I had to do, to see if there was anything left worth saving. Over the next few weeks, we continued with the counseling sessions, each one peeling back another layer of the pain we had been burying for so long. Karen opened up more about her feelings of emptiness, about how she had started questioning herself and our marriage long before Doug entered the picture. She talked about how, after the kids had moved out, she had felt like her purpose had been stripped away, leaving her adrift in a life she didn't recognize anymore. It was hard to hear. It was hard to listen to her talk about how disconnected she had felt, how she had been struggling in silence while I had been oblivious. But it also made me realize something important. I hadn't been paying attention. I hadn't noticed that my wife was drifting further and further away because I was too caught up in my own routine, in my own expectations of what our marriage was supposed to be. I wasn't blameless in this. Karen's actions were her own, and I would never excuse the affair. But the cracks in our marriage had been there for years, and we had both ignored them. One night, after a particularly tough session, Karen and I sat in the car outside the therapist's office. Neither of us saying anything. The air between us felt heavy, but it was different now. There was a sense of vulnerability that hadn't been there before, a rawness that came from being forced to confront the parts of ourselves we had been too afraid to face. "I never wanted to hurt you," Karen said quietly, breaking the silence. "I know," I replied, staring out the window. "But you did," she nodded, her hands resting on the steering wheel. "I know, and I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make it up to you, if you'll let me." I turned to look at her, and for the first time in weeks, I saw the woman I had fallen in love with all those years ago. She wasn't perfect. None of us were, but she was trying. And maybe that was enough. Maybe trying was all we could do for now. "I don't know what's going to happen," I said honestly. "I don't know if I can ever fully forgive you, but I'm here. I'm still here, and I want to figure this out, if we can." Karen's eyes filled with tears, and she reached over, taking my hand in hers. "That's all I'm asking for, a chance to fix this. To fix us." We sat there, holding hands in the quiet darkness, both of us knowing that the road ahead was still long and uncertain. But for the first time, I felt like we were walking it together, instead of drifting apart. That night, when we got home, Karen didn't go to the bedroom. Instead, she followed me to the guest room where I had been staying. She stood in the doorway, hesitant, her eyes searching mine for some kind of permission. "Can I stay?" she asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper. I hesitated, unsure if I was ready for that step. But then I nodded, moving over to make room for her in the bed. She climbed in beside me, and for a long time we lay there in silence, the weight of everything that had happened still between us, but something else there too, a small, fragile thread of hope. I didn't reach for her, and she didn't reach for me. But the fact that we were lying there together, side by side, felt like progress. It felt like we were starting to rebuild, piece by piece. We had a long way to go, and I wasn't naive enough to think that things would be easy from here on out. There would still be hard days, days when the anger and the hurt would bubble up again, threatening to tear us apart. But for the first time in a long time, I felt like we had a chance, a real chance, to make it through. As I drifted off to sleep, Karen's breathing steady beside me, I realized that forgiveness wasn't a single moment. It wasn't something that happened all at once. It was a process, one that would take time, patience, and a lot of work. But as long as we were both willing to try, maybe, just maybe, we could find our way back to each other. In the weeks that followed, Karen and I settled into a new rhythm, one that felt fragile but full of possibility. The counseling sessions continued, and each time, we chipped away at the walls we had built up over the years. There were still moments when the hurt felt fresh, when the thought of her affair with Doug hit me like a punch to the gut. But those moments were becoming less frequent. The anger that had consumed me in the beginning had started to soften, replaced by something more complex, an understanding of how we had both failed each other, and the realization that maybe, just maybe, we could still find a way forward. The hardest part was learning to trust again. Every time Karen left the house, I found myself wondering where she was going, who she was talking to. It was instinctive now, this suspicion that hovered over everything. I hated that I felt that way, and I hated that she knew it too. There were times when I'd catch her glancing at me, her face filled with guilt and worry, like she was waiting for me to accuse her of something she hadn't done, but we didn't avoid it. We talked about it openly, about how trust would take time, about how we needed to rebuild it together. One evening, after a particularly difficult session, we sat in the living room watching the fire crackle in the hearth. Karen was curled up in the armchair, a blanket draped over her legs, while I sat on the couch, staring into the flames. The room was quiet, except for the soft pop and hiss of the wood burning, and I could feel the weight of everything we'd been through pressing down on us. "I miss how easy it used to be," Karen said softly, breaking the silence. I looked over at her, her face illuminated by the glow of the fire. She looked tired, but there was a warmth in her expression that hadn't been there in months, a softness that reminded me of the woman I had fallen in love with all those years ago. "It was never easy," I said, managing a small smile. "We just thought it was." Karen smiled back, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "I guess you're right, but it felt easier." I nodded, understanding what she meant. There had been a time when things between us had felt effortless, when we didn't have to work so hard to stay connected. But now, after everything that had happened, we had to fight for it. Every day was a choice to keep trying, to keep moving forward, even when it felt like the weight of the past might drag us down. "I don't know if we'll ever get back to where we were," I admitted, my voice quiet. "But maybe that's okay. Maybe we're not supposed to." Karen looked at me, her eyes filled with a mixture of hope and sadness. "What do you mean?" "I mean, maybe this is the next phase," I said, struggling to put my thoughts into words. "We can't go back. Too much has happened, but that doesn't mean we can't build something new." Karen was quiet for a long time, her gaze drifting back to the fire. "I want that," she said finally. "I want to build something new with you, Phil. I know I don't deserve it, but I'm willing to fight for it. Every day." I felt a lump rise in my throat at her words. This wasn't the same Karen who had confessed to the affair weeks ago. This was a woman who had been broken, who had seen the worst parts of herself, and who was trying, truly trying to make things right. And as much as I had doubted whether or not I could forgive her, sitting there in that moment, I realized that I already had, at least in part. "I'm willing to fight for it too," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "But it's going to take time. We both know that." Karen nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. "I know. I'm ready for that." There was a long pause as we sat there, the fire casting shadows on the walls, the warmth filling the room. For the first time in a long time, I felt like we were truly on the same page, like we were moving in the same direction instead of pulling away from each other. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. Over the next few months, things slowly began to change. The trust wasn't fully back yet, but it was building. I no longer felt the need to check where Karen was going or who she was talking to. She made a point to be transparent with me, and in return, I found myself letting go of the suspicion bit by bit. It wasn't easy, and there were still hard days when the memory of the affair would rear its ugly head, but we faced those moments together instead of letting them tear us apart. One evening, as we were getting ready for bed, Karen came into the room holding an old photo album. She sat down beside me on the bed, flipping through the pages with a small smile on her face. "Remember this?" she asked, pointing to a picture of us from our first vacation together, a trip to the beach when we were still in our 20s. I chuckled, looking at the photo. We looked so young, so carefree. "Yeah, you made me carry that giant cooler across the entire beach because you didn't want to leave it in the car." Karen laughed softly, her eyes bright with the memory. "I didn't think it was that heavy." We spent the next hour flipping through the album, laughing at the old photos, reminiscing about the life we had shared. It was the first time in months that we had allowed ourselves to just be us again, to remember the good times without the weight of everything that had happened hanging over our heads. As we neared the end of the album, Karen grew quiet, her fingers tracing the edges of a photo of our family from a few years ago, taken at Daniel's wedding. She looked up at me, her eyes filled with tears. "I don't want to lose this," she whispered. "I don't want to lose us." I reached over, taking her hand in mine. "We're not lost," I said softly. "We're still here." She squeezed my hand, her tears spilling over. "Thank you," she whispered, "for giving us another chance." I nodded, my own emotions catching in my throat. "We've got a long way to go," I reminded her gently. "But we're getting there." And we were. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't the same as it had been before. But it was something new, something stronger. We had been tested in a way I never thought we would be, but we were still standing. Together. As I lay in bed that night, Karen's head resting on my shoulder, I realized that forgiveness wasn't about forgetting. It wasn't about pretending that everything was okay or erasing the pain of what had happened. It was about choosing to move forward, about rebuilding something new from the ashes of what had been lost. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough.